Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome, and welcome. I am so excited for this conversation. It's always nice to be in the company of friends. I consider everybody who's here with me today a friend, and all of you in the audience, too. But this is a really important conversation that I've been yearning to have. And I'm really lucky that I talked some folks with some real expertise in this space to have the conversation with me. So, the conversation we're having today is about BLM, the BLM movement, and the AAPI movements, and the implications societally on us at work, right? And the things that we have to experience, the things that we experience, the implications of what we experience, and then some of the strategies that we might employ in organizations to manage them. Because I think there's this overwhelming thing that it's the same thing, that we experience the same things, and that the solutions in corporate spaces should be the same. So we're going to explore that and have the conversations. I have three amazing people with me today. I'm going to start with Alice Leclerc, who is a CHRO at FPS at Euromoney Institutional Investor, based in New York. I also have with me David McQueen, who is an entrepreneur, a speaker, a professional speaker, an executive coach. He is the person I go to for all things everything, who is based in the UK. And then I also am really lucky to have with us Christy Henderson, who is the global head of diversity and inclusion at Anomaly, who is based in Los Angeles. So we're kind of spanning the globe a bit, at least half of it. And I'm really excited to get into the conversation. So, what I would just kind of like to start with, and I think it's a really important frame because we often leap into these questions. We leap into, so what about this and what do we do? But actually, I'd like to start with your experiences. This last year has been a moment, right? It has been a real moment. And I think we've all had pretty deep and sometimes traumatic experiences. And I'd like to kind of start with that as a frame. So before we start talking about how we're going to solve it, what's it been like for you over the past year? And what's your experience been? I'm going to kick off with Alice. Alice, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, India. It's an absolute honor to be here, and to my co-panelists, it's such a pleasure. I share a similar spirit to everybody on this panel, and so I'm just going to jump right into this conversation and lift up that we've all watched with horror the rhetoric of leaders in very powerful political positions and media empires unleash information to all of us as a global community on many fronts that created conflict, that drove an environment of panic. And as it specifically relates to the AAPI community, to unlock hate speech into a world that was already suffering from a heightened sense of exhaustion, depression, heartbreak, anxiety, you name it, just compounded the issues into what we have been seeing continuously unfold. And so to this intelligent question of experience and how that has touched into my life as an individual and particularly at work, I'm going to share an honest account of something that happened to me. And let's just take a minute to think about what our calendars look like at work, the hours we throw ourselves into in order to meet the needs of our customers, our stakeholders, our shareholders. Then let's also think about the day that I was walking down the hallway. I was followed into the restroom, and looking me into the in my eyes, this woman said to me, "Are you sick?" And I want to be very clear. This did not happen at my current employer. But I had taken a holiday to Japan way back in February of 2020. Japan, of course, was not a country with return quarantine requirements, and anyone with access to a map would have been able to prove that Wuhan, China, not down the street from Kyoto, Japan, and yet occupants on this particular floor of this building were getting freaked out. And it's obviously a longer story, but the point I'm trying to land with the telling of it is that when you experience something like this at work, because of what you represent in the eyes of others and the judgments that they then feel empowered to place, it takes and it took a significant push of focused resilience, compassion, and dialogue to get myself back on track so that I would still uphold the high standards of quality that I knew I was capable of, but the framing of who I was coming into work had indeed been altered through an experience such as that.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And because and that's the thing, right? We all have these experiences. And when I think about specifically, I mean, we're talking and it's become more mainstream lately and we'll come back to it. But if you look at the increase in violence against Asian communities over the last year and a half, particularly in the US, it's 150%, 160%. And we'll come back and talk about that. But I think, there is the experience that we have with people, but also the threat around safety, which is something I'd really like to come back to. Christy, I would love to hear about what it's been like for you over the last year, your experience. You're in a big global role where you're thinking about this stuff around the world.
Oh yeah. It's been a ride. It's been a ride both personally and professionally for the last year. And we've seen a lot of truths come to the surface. We've seen a lot of the violence that many of our communities experience on a day-to-day basis surface much differently than it had before. Not saying that it was new violence, but we've definitely seen it come to the forefront much more than ever before. We've seen the disparities at every level, whether it's healthcare, economic, political, have a very strong play in this last year. And for me, it's been an ongoing challenge to balance the professional impact of that and what it means to your teams and to your talent and to kind of the everyday work we do, in addition to understanding that as a member of the community, we also participate in this world, in this space, a little bit differently than many of our team members and coworkers would. And so exhaustion is not a strong enough word to describe what the past year has been, but that's definitely one that helps make the point. And I think exhaustion and just unapologetic self-care and protection has been my space for the past year, and making sure that that is not only a personal thing, but that I am honoring that professionally for myself and for my colleagues and team members as we navigate these uncharted waters.
Thank you, Christy. I mean, self-care, that's a theme. That is a theme that, that I've been hearing a lot of, and one that I don't think any of us can take lightly or for granted. David, you bring a perspective from the UK, right? And I'd love for you to talk about that because people often assume that because they often assume the implications are different for people in the UK who are from marginalized or underrepresented groups. I'd love to hear your take on that in terms of your experience over what the last year has been like for you.
So it's been an interesting one. And I think I'll speak for the UK and some of the touch points I've had working with Black communities around the globe as part of my work as well, if you don't mind. And I think the first instance is the denial. The denial that first started when when the whole incident started with George Floyd. In the UK, a lot of people are very good at denying that they're racist. The country is not racist. This is the least racist country in the world, apparently. This is the quote that I've heard. And for someone who lives there, I can tell you that it's not. And what was quite interesting was for working in this space and trying to get a lot of individuals to understand that talking about race and racial inequality, specifically as it pertained to Black members of staff, was something that we've been pushing for many years. Then all of a sudden, a couple of these black squares goes up, and everybody's like, "Oh yeah, it actually does happen." And there were a couple of points where it was quite emotional for me because I was thinking, "Hold on, I've been saying this for 7 years, and you're just waking up to it right now." And then I think the bit that really made me realize how deep this was working with a number of global companies. And in Europe never talks about race, and seeing a lot of Black voices raise their voices in France and in the Netherlands and in Germany and in Spain. And then to hear other voices raised across the Middle East and the Asian Pacific and Latin America, as well as North America, I realized that this was a real massive moment in time. It was a moment to be seized. But I was also very dubious that it would last a little while, and then with the news cycle, the new news cycle that come, it would just go. And I believe that North America led the way in this, and so eyes were on what was happening politically in America and seeing what would happen in the UK as well. And I just took the time to seize the moment. Um, but to an earlier point made as well, I made sure that I had my self care in place because I wanted to look after me and my family. But it was so interesting to realize that there was this what I'm going to call a racial awakening, and everybody all of a sudden realized there was some kind of race issue going on here. And then as soon as it came up, it seemed within a few months that it disappeared as well. And I looked and I was like, well, wow, okay, let's see how this is going to happen in the long term. And to be fair, the main emphasis was for me was how do I look after me and my family? I want to make sure that that circle is looked after first and foremost, and then I can speak to other spaces. But yes, it was an interesting and continues to be an interesting emotional roller coaster. Considering how people see race and all the different touch points of that in the last year, it's been a very interesting journey.
Thank you. It kind of brings me on to when you talk about interesting journey, and I kind of touched upon safety and what that feels like. And that, one would assume that in your workspace, particularly, you may be insulated from some of the things that you might experience in the open environment, though only under the guise of professionalism per se, and even not then all the time. But one of the things that I, like I talked about the fact that we've seen violence in the AAPI community rise like 150, 160% in the last year. But it's like all of these things. Things like this are often happening and they may have increased, but they're often happening, but not necessarily mainstream. So people in those communities who experience it know that it happens, but people outside of that only understand it when it becomes mainstream. So Alice, this is a question for you. Is the current environment worse? I mean, is it? And I think it is to some extent. But are there issues around hate and violence that are only now becoming mainstream that have always kind of been there, but you may have experienced it differently? Just I'm curious to understand that.
I've been asked this question a bit this year, and I really appreciate it because it tells me that people are paying attention. They're getting concerned, if not more concerned, and elevating conversations around injustice, around social justice. And the the answer to the question is that it is worse. I agree. And not only because of the data that stands as evidence of it being worse, but because the everyday life of the AAPA community was such that there were always places and situations where we knew to be more cognizant and alert to surroundings. But if we take a lens of current times, our community wasn't fraught with worry for over a year with regards to things like going to church, picking up medication, earning a living, waiting for the bus, being who we are. When a year plus driven by hate equated to the elderly members of our community being shoved to the ground, kicked repeatedly in the head, or worse, being hospitalized, equally worse, being put into the hospital, when that is happening to people who are of an elderly age, these all point to something becoming much worse. And yes, to your point, India, bias, racism, discrimination, those things always had a degree of vibration in our society. But over the past year and a half plus, what we see is an exponential increase in the acting out of a very hate-driven set of actions against a community that, just like everybody else, is trying to earn a living, trying to live their best life and live in safety and prosperity.
Wow, that brings me to that is the perfect segue, because I would say that that's what I've been hearing in Black communities for 25 years. I'm talking about at work. I mean, even coming to work. I mean, that has always been the conversation. I just want to live my life. I want to be able to go to the store. I want to be able to get on the bus. I want to be able to drive. I want to be able to do anything, right? It's those things. And so yeah, I think that is such a great point, because I think that here's the thing, and this is one of the kind of titles of this was around solidarity and conflict, right? And actually, we have very similar stories between Black communities and the AAPI communities in terms of what we're experiencing right now. And if you look back historically, which people don't often do, and I refer to history because when you look at the timeline and you used to go back to like the 17 and 1800s, well, 1800s particularly, you can see some really significant things happen. Chinese Immigration Act in the U.S., and that was like way in the 1800s. There were things around exclusion that happened very early, which were also embedded in the fabric of the society. So, Christy, I want to come to you about this now, because I want to talk about the fact that the BLM movement is often kind of vilified, right, and being seen as exclusive, and there are a whole bunch of things that come around that. But I want to think about what we might actually do in the workplaces and how it shows up for you, what it means for you, when you hear it at work, and actually how you respond to the vilification sometimes of those letters in workspaces.
Whew, boy, I think the Blackness is vilified no matter where you are. And so I see that regardless of which office I'm in. Right now, I'm in our New York office. I see it in New York, LA, Berlin, UK, Toronto, you name it. I think that it's very interesting. Alice raised a great point, and I jotted down some notes, just a couple of the things she mentioned, just being able to go to church, Charleston, being able to pick up medication, being able to walk to the bus, being hospitalized, being beat to the ground, all of these things that are such a part of our Black lives, specifically in North America and the UK, and around the globe, that it has been a challenge for me personally, if I'm honest, and interesting professionally, to say, hey, if we solved for the least of these, if we paid attention to those who were most left out of the conversation or most impacted and disadvantaged in whatever community you name, we would have a foundation in place to help when other or new situations arose. And so, I often think that if we took the lead in doing the right thing when any community was harmed or any community had violence against them, we would begin to build an infrastructure to protect other communities when that same thing happened. And there are so many examples of, and I use the term Asian American loosely, but the AAPI community and the Black North American community standing in solidarity and moving through movements just for those specific reasons of safety and protection of self. And, we won't jump into the huge political need for having these different identities and the power in numbers, but for sheer safety and protection of our body and our physical space. And so it's not new, but it's not lost on me that we definitely are seeing an uptick. It is another rallying cry that we've got to get this thing right for one and for all, because if any are left out, all are left out. And so I think it's a new opportunity to really question how we do the work, how we support and protect the communities of our talent and our teams, and where we're getting it right and where we're getting it wrong. And lastly, I'll just say it's part of it is the challenge of being able to balance this public narrative that pits the Black community against the Asian community in a way that is just actually not true, to be quite honest. There are many falsehoods in it, but it's not helpful to the safety of any and all of us. And so it's been interesting to see the outside really come inside into the workspace. And I think part of that is because our workspaces are our homes now, which is much different in being able to separate the two, but also understanding that the moment that we're in is a new public moment, but it isn't a new moment to either of the communities or any of the communities that are experiencing this, because we've all been historically excluded from the conversation from the beginning of time.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for that. I mean, like my strap line from that is equity for all, right? It's kind of, and that's the goal. The goal is absolutely equity for all. And David, as I think about the UK, right, and having lived there for 20 years, I know a couple of things about it, but not like a native like you. And so but I do want to kind of just touch on the environmental issues that people face and how some of the things that we're talking about on this side of the pond show up on that side of the pond, because people will say that it's different. But what are some of the things that you see? And I think starting with the fact that Asian in the terms of North America is different than what people talk about as it relates to Asian, and that even the language in the UK. So if we can start with that, and then just kind of your views around those environmental issues, that would be great.
Oh, definitely. So so when the term Asian is being used here in the UK, it tends to refer to South Asian. So we're talking about India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or what have you, and it tends to exclude Asia Pacific. And it's been an opportunity, I will say, for a lot of members of the Asian Pacific community in the UK to have their voices heard, because it wasn't really heard before. Whenever you did hear about Asian, it was dominated by the South Asian voice, as it were. But with the pandemic and a lot of the hate that came out towards members, as you would say in America, the AAPI community here in the UK, voices did start to be raised. But then what we actually realized as well is that kind of negative voice went back even further to 2016, when we had Brexit and England was moving out of Europe to be its own, to come out of the European Union. And having conversations with a lot of people, they were saying, no, the conversations about hatred happened long before COVID came along. People were being very nasty and people were being very racist and horrible. But as a community, it was almost very quiet. But I would say a younger generation were like, no, we're not going to be quiet about this anymore. The older generation would say, keep your head down and do what we've got to do. But the younger ones are like, nah, we're not having this anymore. We're not playing with this. And I think a lot of people were emboldened across the board by what happened with the Black Lives Matter movement. And there was a sense of solidarity and community by people of color to raise our voices and to talk about that. And again, the differences are, again, to your point around the term Asian, it is very different, but the impact is the same. The impact is definitely the same. And there has been a reckoning for people to realize that this is a lot more widespread than what people think is this one racist incident. No, this has been woven through the community all across the UK, and now it's come to light. So it's in many ways it is quite similar to what's happening in North America, and it has a British sense of denial more, because I think especially in North America, you know where those racial lines are drawn. You just know exactly where they are. In the UK, everybody pretends that they're going to assimilate and everybody's fine. Let's go down and have a pint and a couple of chips and everything will be fine. And it just doesn't work like that. And so being able to have that voice where not only within the community, but within the corporate spaces as well, which, to be very fair, wasn't something that wasn't really happening before, because everybody was dumped into this horrible term called BAME. So Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. And everybody who wasn't white was thrown into this group with no sense of nuance around it. What actually happened was there was this opportunity for people to go, okay, let me take a step back and talk about my narrative and exactly where I'm coming from. And that awareness, I think, was really, really powerful. For people to be able to speak up, especially who hadn't spoken before, I thought that was incredibly powerful.
No, thank you. I mean, it's interesting you should raise the issue around BAME, because I similarly, and people have their views about it. I similarly feel the same way about the word BIPOC because there are Indigenous people generally nowhere in these conversations, to be honest. It tends to be Black people, people of color, and that's a big group, right? And so there is something about identifying people as who they are and respecting and reflecting their experiences for what it is. And so, which brings me on to the next point I wanted to raise, and I think Alice and Christy, I'd like to talk to both of you, and you're kind of in the corporate spaces that you sit. And David, I'd like to touch on you with this too, given your client base. But I think Christy, I'll kind of start with the fact that folks are not necessarily accepting that the issues that we face, and let's call it the Black community and the AAPI community, are different in terms of how they show up. And so when corporations are coming up with solutions, they're wanting to do that with a singular lens. And so the question is, are they this? Should they be treated in your estimation, in your experience? Should they be treated the same in terms of strategies? If so, what yes and what no?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think we have to know when to generalize and when to individualize, and it isn't always helpful in all situations to put them in a bucket. The interesting thing is we're now BIPOC, and BIPOC drives me absolutely crazy. We don't address anti-Blackness with BIPOC. We say we're diverse, and there are 0 Indigenous people in the room, 1 Black person in the room, and the room is filled with 500 people. But we're extremely diverse because of BIPOC. It is also interesting to see people of color moved from the bucket of, we were before in corporate America, it was people of color and youth. They were all under the same budgets and the marketing campaigns. And I was like, wait, so everybody who's a person of color, regardless of their age or generation, we're putting them in the same bucket as our youth. And now we're creating a plan that targets all of them. Didn't work. It's not working now. And so I think that it is really important for us to understand the differences, the nuances, the historical significance of different groups if we actually are going to begin to create equity for all, as you said, India. And it will not happen when we put everyone in one bucket. It's almost as if you have non-white who is asked to share one plate. Everybody eats off of this one plate. And then you have white in another bucket. And I think that what we're trying to get to is equity to hopefully one day see equality. And that means everyone needs their own place, space, attention, and strategy when it comes to better integrating our different communities into the workplace and the workforce that we're doing differently. So yeah, there's a place and space that the numbers matter. And that's a voting power, that's a political power. But there's also how do I create safe spaces and brave spaces for the teams and talents that build my company and my organization. And we can't put everyone into one bucket and assume that we're solving for all.
Thank you. That's where my head is, but it's always interesting to see what people think about it, because I would imagine, when you think about, especially Alice, I'm coming to you as a CHRO, who kind of has to see all of the human element of an organization. It's kind of interesting because how do you resource the fact that there are these very different groups of people, right? It's kind of, and they are very different. How do you resource managing for that when I'm setting this up, the very different groups of people. And within those groups of people don't necessarily feel the same way about what they want either, right? And that's the other thing. So, when you think about your experiences as an Asian person, and then you think about the fact that we're trying to solve for a whole bunch of different groups who may have different experiences and may not all agree on what they want, how do you build inclusion strategies around that? What are your thoughts around how we might start to approach it in businesses?
I think David has the secret sauce, and when he was talking about the energy and the ideals of our young people. I, as a CHRO, love to lean into the dialogue of young people who represent in terms of ethnic representation and communities. They represent anything from first generation to fifth generation members of the AAPI community. For example, I have Chinese friends whose families have been Californians for over 125 years. I have Chinese friends who are first generation. I have Black friends who, there too, hundreds of years have been on American soil, or have a immigrant story of coming to American soil and their experiences and what they represent and their challenges and voices. And so for a corporation who was looking at the opportunity that as Christy brilliantly refers to as a new public moment, as a corporation is looking at that thoughtfully and responsibly, I personally like to see more bringing together, because then we can get less concerned and stressed over aligning the acronym and its current state, and are those letters inclusive enough? Is it accidentally not inclusive enough? But instead, the spirit of advancing the agenda of equality, of justice, of being seen and heard and included in the workplace, and being brave enough to say, let's also respect the origin story of the communities that we give voice to. The reality is that within different communities are different origin stories of where ancestors came into, again, well, I will talk about North America specifically, came into North America because that is a choice that they made. And they went into that with both eyes open of the difficulties and prejudices and challenges of that. And then we have community representation where that is not the origin story, and we must respect that, and we must be highly inclusive of that, and thoughtful and empathetic to that. And by having those values and behaviors towards different communities, that doesn't automatically equate to discluding others. It can absolutely be a shared agenda of ensuring that we are being very thoughtful and empathetic in a space that can sometimes feel quite overwhelming and crowded. So I like how earlier in this discussion there was the concept of taking a step back and saying, let's we're pretty unified in terms of what we're looking to solve for. The nuances and differences are something that we can respect and pay honor to, while also teaming up together and solving for the agenda that we are arm in arm walking forwards towards.
Awesome. That says a lot, because that's, I think, the issue. Like, I love my solidarity in my title. The solidarity piece is important, right? And it's not in it. And when we say solidarity, it's not us against them. It's not us against anybody. It is kind of people marching towards a common goal, right? And I think that's the key, that I kind of took from that. So thank you for that, Alice. David, so you have lots of global corporate clients. You are also extremely vocal around your views around all of this, and very
Yes.
openly. And and I love to, if you're not following David McQueen on LinkedIn, you have to go and follow this man on LinkedIn. You will see and read some very interesting, he writes this amazing stuff, but also very thought provoking and sometimes provocative content, which is awesome because it gets people thinking and talking. So how have your clients responded to that? Because I'm sure that they follow you on LinkedIn. How have your majority culture clients responded to you using your voice in the way that you do? Because you've always been somebody that you've always said what you thought, but your voice has been one of the bigger ones on the platforms that I experience, in this space in the UK. And so, how do they respond to that? And what do they have to say?
Well, I've told my clients, before you engage me, go and have a look at my LinkedIn. Okay, go and have a look at my profile. Go and have a look what I write. I speak straight. I swear sometimes I will say what I have to say. I want you to know this is what you're going to be associating yourself with. And I remember actually one client, a large law firm, coming back to me last year saying, well, given that you're working with us, we think, maybe the tone of it should be changed in some way. And I said, I told you to go and read my profile. I'm not changing. And now that we have the situation front and center, I'm not playing with this at all. And I will be very direct about it, because again, as I said, I've had to deal with some global clients who have really missed the nuance of this conversation. I'll give you a quick example. One of the things that happened before last year was the lack of intersectionality when it came to gender representation. And I just said to people, look, all you're doing out there is you're placating to white middle class women. Let's just not pretend that that's what it is. And they were like, well, no, well, that's not actually the case. Well, this is the way that we're moving. And I said, no, you have to be intersectional. I said, let me give you some examples. I said, I know there are a lot of black women on my timeline, both in North America and in the UK and Europe, who have not had advancement because they have had to code switch so much, and the amount of energy it takes out to have the right hairstyle, to think about the way that you're moderating your tone, to soften your accent, to even tone down your assertiveness, because it might be perceived as aggressive. And I said, I don't give them that advice, but I know people have had to do that. But when you start to talk about all this gender stuff, you miss that out. I said, on the flip side, I think of a lot of Asian Pacific women who are brilliant people in technology, who are doing really well, but they do not get past middle management, because you have this assumption that quiet leadership doesn't play any role in your organization. So because somebody's not being out there and boisterous and shouting and kind of tearing down the room or telling you to lean in, yes, I did, all right, because you don't see that as the ideal of gender, you push that individual to the side. And I say, what you need to understand, and I'm glad for this opportunity that we had with George Floyd, albeit that was a tragic situation, and even what we've had with the Stop Asian Hate campaign, it's made people go, okay, this is in your face now. You cannot pretend that this doesn't exist anymore. You have to go on a granular and nuanced level to have this conversation. But it's also forced a lot of individuals. I'm working with an e-commerce client in Canada, and it's really forced individuals to see that nuance, as you said. There is Asian Pacific, there is African American, there is Hispanic, there is indigenous American communities, where very often those voices weren't heard from. And very often, even the voices that came forward were predominantly male. And so we needed to have that bit where a lot of strong female voices and representation and experiences were put into the open. And so I said to people, I'm going to write about him. And I said, you can have the conversation with me, and whether you like it or not, I'm not going to put your name on blast, but you'll know who I'm talking about. You will know exactly what it is. And I'm going to speak truth to power, because for me, this is not a game. These are people's lives. People are going and changing their names on CVs or resumes, as you call them. People are going and having to tone down who they are and lose. And essentially, I'm having to have to pick up pieces of people who are being burnt out, who no longer want to work in industries, who no longer feel safe in those spaces. So while I'm in a position of power, and I can use my voice, and I will challenge people to come to me with the data and the facts and my positioning around organizational change, culture, and leadership, I'm going to speak truth to power. And if you don't like it, then, by all means, you could always cease the contract, but I'll put you on blast again. So fortunately, most people, they run on the conversation with me, but they know exactly. I say what I do on the tin. I'm not going to apologize about that at all.
That level of honesty also, I appreciate the level of honesty. And here's the thing, and Allison, Christy, I'd like to get your take on this. That level of honesty is good, and it's a wonderful thing to be able to do. But for people in some corporate environments, it's also tied to their livelihood, and they won't necessarily, or don't feel like they can, because of the spaces that they occupy. Right. And so, I think that there's something also about the cultural work we have to do to create spaces for people to be able to do that, and to be able to say, hey, this is real for me, and this is what I experience. I'd really like to, Christy, I'll start with you, especially kind of given the role that you have, and you're looking at this global organization. A part of this is about safety for people. How would you, what advice would you give to someone? And I know I'm freestyling a little bit, but what advice would you give to somebody about how they might be able to show up in that way and show up as their kind of true selves with their true voice in the environment that we're in, where there's still, to be fair, some resistance in certain corners around being able to do that?
Absolutely. Certain corners everywhere, at certain tables. I think it's the understanding that I often say to many of my senior leaders who want to create safe space. And there is no safety in this moment. There is no safety in activism, and there's no safety in our freedom. And so, what that means is, as opposed to trying to create safe spaces, my goal is to create brave spaces within the organization. And so, I cannot promise you that it's going to be seamless. I can't promise you that it's going to be uncomfortable. I actually can promise you quite the opposite. It will be extremely uncomfortable if we're going to actually impact change or implement change that we want to see. I think that one of the unique roles with the new booming of DE&I professionals is that for once we have the opportunity of being called to the table to speak our truth and to be direct, to address issues head on, that now creates the opportunity to make space for others who don't necessarily have that title attached to them and have to be a little bit more careful with what they say and how they say it. And I know that that's the reality because I've been in both spaces. Interestingly enough, when I came to Anomaly, part of the conversation I had with senior leadership is that I'm an organizer. I'm a gatekeeper for communities and those who have been historically excluded from the conversation. I am not a DE&I professional. And so if that is what you're looking for in this role, I'm not the one. Now, if you want to talk about racial equity, if you want to talk about equity building across the board, if you want to talk about organizing, then you have the right person. And so it was very welcoming for me to see a space that did not want to employ a DE&I professional in this role because they realized that had we understood, if we were getting it right and we knew the tricks and the steps and the policies and the processes, we wouldn't be in this place and space that we are now. And so I think that it's critically important to understand the connection and correlation that organizing and activism has to the work that we're doing within the corporate space and how important it is to bring that understanding and experience into the world. And so, we are creating opportunities for many of us to speak up in ways and places that they haven't before. And we're holding ourselves accountable to our truths. There are certain days that I say some things and I'm like, listen, after I say this, I'm probably going to have to pack up, turn in my cards, and it's over. But it's critically important for me and for my family and for my legacy to be direct, to be honest, and to be a gatekeeper to create brave spaces for all the communities who have not been a part of the conversation.
Yeah, that says it all in a nutshell in terms of just kind of the kinds of things that we have to think about because I think that there are so many people. I mean, for the first time ever, for example, I was working with a client who said that they got a list of demands from their millennials around what needed to happen and how it needed to happen. Right. And that is and responding to that, because this group, like David kind of pointed out, is not going to walk away quietly or lightly. Right. They got this list of kind of, here's what we expect. Here's what we expect you to do. And Alice, I'm going to throw this one to you because, again, given the role that you sit in, if that were your organization, you would have probably you'd have probably gotten the email. You'd have been on the list of here's the things that we demand and here's what we want. How do you, and so the question I have is about, and I get the people part, but balancing the wants and demands of an on-demand culture, which is what we live in, versus the reality of moving big organizations and the how long it actually takes to change culture. So the wants and demands of we want this now is one thing, but you can give a list of demands, we can meet those demands, but that doesn't necessarily change the underlying cultural structures that continue to perpetuate the behaviors. How do you balance that? How do you satisfy those folks while you're trying to do the other?
Absolutely. And I will first say that reading the room is a life skill as well as an executive development skill. And if I say, "Well, that's a really nice bridge," and someone says, "Oh, do you want to go bungee jumping off of it?" I'm not going to be against the idea outright, but I am going to breathe a bit and say, I perhaps, and maybe be a little curious. Well, that's where I have to tie a rope around my ankle and hurl myself off of the bridge from hundreds of feet in the air. I suppose I could, but I think I need a little more information and maybe I want to ask some questions about this. Likewise, when we approach topics that we might be quite comfortable raising in a room, putting on a wish list, because that has been our dialogue, both internally and externally, for I'm not going to say how many years I've been having that dialogue, a number of years. There's a super user fluidity to my narrative around those things that I can't expect to place on other people who come into the room. And so that's why I really respect and value this concept of brave spaces, where we say in a very open and candid way, this is going to be a facilitated approach for us to be together and to ask the questions that are going to elevate the things that we kind of expect everyone is thinking, but not brave enough to ask. So let's just, in this brave space, ask it. And let's be real with ourselves. If we're members of the same community and we don't agree, let's also get that on the table and make sure that we understand where the other person is coming from. And the last thing that I would say about that is, when we do get these lists of things that identify where people think there are opportunities and gaps. Yes, it is in the presenter's mind a request list, but in our mind, on the receiving end, those could be anything from hypothesis to evidence of what it is like for these people to be at virtual or in office work. And in that sense, it really is a beautiful service that they're providing in terms of where they believe these pinpricks are on the employee experience. And that's why it's important that when we do the dialogue and build into the frameworks to try to be that much closer to what this list is calling to our attention, we don't want to infer that it's a promissory note that we've received. We want to be very frank about the fact that these are things that are thoughtful, and we will take it seriously, and that they are valuable and meaningful. But there's a lot of other things that we want to bring into the context with which we can begin to work together in conversing about them.
Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, that balance, the on demand versus, I tell my children all the time, you want to know something, you look it up on your Google. When I wanted to know something at your age, I had to wait for my mom to come home from work to drive me to the library if she had time, for me to get photocopies of something out of the encyclopedia if I had enough coins to get the copies, and then bring it back home. And then, oops, I forgot something, and I had to wait for another 4 days to go back because my mom couldn't take me. I mean, and so that on-demand information has created this thing which has made it really challenging to balance. And so I wish we had like forevermore, because this conversation has been a tremendous one. And as we kind of come into the close, I'd like to do a rapid fire with each of you and just kind of ask you a question and get your views as we kind of close this out. And so I'm going to start with David, because David, I'd really like you. You are writing an amazing book that I've been privy to hearing some things about, but it is entitled
The Brave Leader.
Thank you. And so it kind of, and this was not a plan, people who are watching this was not a plan. The bravery in the conversation was not a plan. It is kismet that we landed here in this way. Christy and Alice did not talk about brave because I prompted them to David. But David, I'd love for you just to kind of talk about a little bit, in a minute or so, about that concept, about your book, and what it will provide for folks as we kind of we think about how we have to be brave in these spaces.
Indeed. So I realize the majority of leadership actually sits just under the C-suite in a lot of organizations, and many people aren't equipped with the tools to make really good decisions and to think through problems and have them inclusive. So what I wanted to do was pull together a lot of the thoughts from my coaching, my workshops, my experience to say, right, if you're going to have an inclusive leadership team or atmosphere, and if you're going to have a culture that prioritizes equity and then works its way back to making sure that every aspect of the organization can be aligned to that equity, then you have to be brave. Brave the verb, brave the adjective, and then brave is the acronym: bold, resilient, agile, visionary, and ethical. Book soon come later this year.
Yay, I can't wait. I can't wait. Thank you, David. I'm gonna come to you, Christy. Um, you've been doing this work. So you're at Anomaly now, but organizing has been what you have been known for a very long time. What would you tell long time? And I mean, and I've seen it, just kind of looking at your career and what you've done. What would you tell a younger person who has that sensibility but is having difficulty finding the space in the corporate particular business spaces that they inhabit?
Make a space. Create your own and then make a space. I think that oftentimes we ask for permission far too much as opposed to just going ahead and doing what it is that your spirit, your heart, and your soul is telling you to do. And had someone told me that at a younger age, the road might have been a little smoother, but I am grateful for the bumps and the bruises. And so I would tell all young people who sit in a similar space, do it. Create it, make it, go for it. Don't ask for permission, only for forgiveness, and push through. I think that we are at a very unique time that the world and the space is open and prime and ready for new talent, for young energy, for new expertise. To you guys' point, our younger people are not here for patience, for time, for extending this process. They want to get it right and they want to get it right now. And I think that there's a place and space for both to exist. And so we need it. We need the pressure. We need the accountability. I would lean into them to go ahead and do everything that you think and you imagine. And the lessons will expose themselves along the way that will direct you on your next path, on your next journey. But you just have to do it. Got to lean in.
Awesome. So, Alice, last but certainly not least, you work at one of my favorite companies in the world. Wonder why. You work at one of my favorite companies in the world. No, but what I will say about Your Money is it's very progressive in terms of the way that it thinks about some of these things. What advice would you give to organizations who haven't been as forward about making some of the changes that need to make? Because you were out there pretty early. I mean, one of the biggest things that I have to tell everybody here, because I do need to give this plug to Money because it's pretty incredible, that Money a few weeks ago announced that any employee could work from anywhere forever, and a 2.5-day work week. I mean, work weekend. Sorry, 2.5-day weekend, not work week. Weekend, 2.5-day weekend. That was my wish, for me, a 2.5-day work week. No, but a 2.5-day weekend. And so when you think about, those are pretty bold moves to make, but you're also doing lots, and there are lots of conversations happening around this stuff in a very open and brave way. What suggestion would you give to organizations who are trying to find their way?
It's going to sound a little bit, but I will just say it. 3 words: release that gut. Just exhale. You're squeezing in. You're feeling stressed to take that. What will people think? How will this be? Release and be inclusive. If you want to take a data-backed view, the data is there that says when you have a diverse board of directors, when you have a diverse group of senior executives, your business statistically year over year will outperform the comparative data set of the similar companies, industries, etc. So we could take that approach to bring that exhale. Or we could also address it from the perspective of being a human being, which is that when we equip ourselves to learn about the world through our talent base, and when we look at that talent base to have it better reflect the world, how much better are we as a company contributing to the world? So again, release that gut, exhale, and be inclusive. It is a beautiful step in the right direction, and all of the indicators back up that this is the time, the place, the moment to move forward inclusively.
Well, I mean, I just say thank you to the three of you, deeply thank you to the three of you for sharing what you shared today. You know, my three takeaways are release your gut, which I love. You know, being brave, being a brave leader, and stepping out, and just getting on and doing it. That's, I mean, Christy, you kind of practice that every day. So I say thank you, Alice. Thank you, David. Thank you, Christy. This has been tremendous. Go and look for these people on LinkedIn. You want to follow them. You want to see what they're doing. But you know, more than that, thank you. That's it. Have a good one. So wasn't that great? So thank you again, David, Alice, and Christy. That was such a fun conversation. And to those of you who are putting things in the chat, I was seeing the chat, but we were so engrossed. I want to just acknowledge a couple of things that came up first. Somebody asked, like, what is BIPOC? And it's Black and Indigenous people of color. I'm not crazy about the term because, as someone rightfully said, also in the chat, I'm reading this. The term BIPOC can be interpreted as a systematic oversimplification of extremely complex, although intersecting, historical and contemporary experiences, denying the specificity that must be acknowledged and voiced so that we can all move towards a future together. I couldn't have said that better myself. Thank you to whomever put that in the chat, because that is actually exactly how I feel about it. I feel like it oversimplifies the experiences of all people in that in underrepresented and marginalized groups. So thank you for that. I really appreciate the Brave Spaces piece. There was commentary in the chat. Again, see, I'm acknowledging you. I'm paying attention about brave spaces and courage. Brave space and having courage is really important. It's critical to how we move forward. So I'm really excited that in a moment we'll be coming back and we'll be talking about centering Indigenous voices. Speaking of BIPOC, the I is for Indigenous. I'll leave that to my colleague Stephen and I to talk about when we come back.